There are stories that chill the blood, and then there are those that make you question reality itself. In 1856, Louisiana, a plantation became the center of terror after the arrival of a young enslaved boy who seemed to carry a curse darker than death itself. Every master who owned him met disaster, some through sickness, some through madness, others through fire and blood. Was it vengeance, coincidence, or something unholy bound to his soul? Tonight, we uncover the forgotten truth behind the slave boy who destroyed everyone he touched. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell, because every story I tell comes from real archives, lost testimonies, and months of research to bring you the darkest pieces of forgotten history. The origins of the boy were as strange as the terror his name would one day inspire. He was said to have been born on a stormy night in 1856, deep in the swamps of Louisiana, on the outskirts of a plantation known for its brutality. The enslaved women who attended his birth whispered that something was wrong, even before he took his first breath. The midwife later told others that the air had grown cold inside the small wooden cabin, and the flickering lantern light dimmed as if something unseen had entered the room. His mother, a young enslaved woman named Eliza, had been silent throughout the labor, almost too silent. When the child was finally born, she refused to look at him. There were no cries, no sound of life, just the heavy silence of confusion and dread. Then slowly the boy opened his eyes, dark, glassy, and fixed in an unblinking stare that unsettled everyone present. The older slaves said he looked far too aware for a newborn, as if he had been born already knowing something the rest of the world could never understand. Eliza finally whispered that the child was not normal, that he should not have lived. Within hours of the birth she was dead, no sign of struggle, no cause that anyone could explain. Her body simply went cold, her face frozen in an expression of terror. The overseers buried her before dawn, and the boy was taken to the main house, where the master's wife reluctantly agreed to raise him until he could work. From the beginning, the plantation workers avoided the child. Animals reacted violently to his presence. Dogs barked and growled, horses refused to go near him, and even the crows that perched on the nearby trees scattered when he approached. The other enslaved people would not touch him, saying that a chill lingered on anything he came near. Some claimed he had strange fits, moments when his eyes would roll back and his small body would convulse without reason. Others swore they saw him staring into the distance, smiling faintly at things no one else could see. The plantation owner, a man named Charles Dumont, dismissed all of this as superstition. He prided himself on being a rational man, and he viewed the talk of curses as foolishness spread among ignorant minds. Yet even he could not ignore the series of misfortunes that began soon after the boy's birth. Crops withered in one section of the fields, though the soil showed no sign of blight. Several enslaved workers fell ill with strange fevers. One of the housemaids, who had been assigned to care for the child, was found dead in her bed one morning, her face pale and eyes wide open, as if she had died of fright. Still, Dumont refused to associate these events with the child. He named the boy Samuel and insisted he would grow up to be strong, capable, and useful. But there was something in the boy's quietness that disturbed even him. Samuel rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a flat, emotionless tone. He never cried, never laughed, and never seemed to react when others shouted or struck him. The older slaves began calling him the Still One. They avoided his shadow and whispered prayers when he passed. By the time Samuel was 5 years old, everyone on the plantation understood that something was deeply wrong. He had never shown affection, never sought comfort, and yet misfortune followed him like a shadow. The overseer's wife, who had once cared for him, fell mysteriously ill and died after only a few days of fever. The master's prized horse broke its leg without cause, and several tools in the fields shattered as if from some unseen pressure. To outsiders, these might have seemed like random events, but to those who lived there, the pattern was undeniable. The boy had brought something with him into the world that no one could name, and everyone feared. By the end of that year, even Charles Dumont began to avoid the child he had once dismissed as harmless. He instructed the workers to keep Samuel away from the main house, to have him sleep in the old smokehouse by the edge of the property. But the damage had already begun. The strange energy that surrounded the boy would soon consume everyone who tried to control him. And the legend of the slave boy who destroyed everyone he touched was only just beginning. The first death that made people whisper about a curse came when Samuel was barely 6 years old. By then, the boy had grown quiet and withdrawn, with a gaze that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared look him in the eyes. The plantation's owner, Charles Dumont, had long tried to suppress the growing unease among his workers. He told them the child was only odd, not evil. But the first accident, as he tried to call it, would change everything. It began on a humid August afternoon, when the overseer, a hard and cruel man named Victor Harlan, decided that Samuel was too slow with his chores. Harlan was known for his temper, and the slaves feared him more than anyone else on the plantation. That day, when Samuel failed to respond quickly to an order, Harlan struck him across the back with his whip. The boy didn't cry out. He didn't even flinch. He only turned and looked at Harlan, long and steady, with that same lifeless stare that had always unsettled people. For a moment Harlan hesitated, feeling a chill run through his spine, despite the burning heat of the Louisiana sun. Then he cursed the boy and stormed off. That night something strange happened. The overseer was found in his quarters, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. His wife said he had woken screaming that the boy's eyes were staring at him in the dark. By morning he was dead. No doctor could explain it. There were no wounds, no sign of poison, just a look of sheer terror frozen on his face. Some said his heart had simply stopped. Others whispered that Samuel had somehow taken it from him. The slaves kept silent, but fear spread like wildfire through the quarters. When Charles Dumont learned of the death, he called it coincidence. He told everyone that Harlan had overworked himself in the heat and forbade any further talk of curses. But deep down, even he couldn't shake the unease that had begun to settle in the house. The servants whispered that the boy had been seen standing outside Harlan's cabin that night, staring up at the window just before the screams began. Dumont questioned him, demanding to know if he'd been there. But Samuel simply shook his head and said in a quiet voice, "He hurt me." That was all. After the overseer's death, strange things began to happen with unsettling regularity. One of the field hands who had laughed about the cursed child was bitten by a snake and died within hours. Another worker who had thrown rocks at Samuel while he fetched water fell from the hayloft a few days later, breaking his neck. No one could prove any connection, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Each person who mocked or hurt the boy seemed to suffer soon after. Even the mistress of the plantation, Mrs. Dumont, began to grow frightened of him. She complained that the boy would appear suddenly in doorways, silent and expressionless, just watching her. Once she claimed she found him standing beside her bed in the middle of the night, staring down at her. When she screamed, he said nothing. He simply turned and walked away. After that, she refused to let him inside the house again. The slaves grew desperate to be rid of him. They begged the master to sell him, to send him away before worse things happened. But no trader would take the boy. Word had already begun to spread beyond the plantation, whispers of the death child, a boy who cursed men with just a look. Even nearby planters began avoiding Dumont, afraid that whatever afflicted his land might spread to theirs. By the end of that summer, the plantation felt heavier, darker. The laughter that once echoed from the fields was gone. Workers moved quickly and spoke little, afraid even to mention the boy's name. Samuel spent most of his time alone, sitting near the edge of the swamp, staring into the water as if he saw something moving beneath its surface. Those who passed by swore they heard him murmuring to himself, sometimes in a language they didn't recognize. The first death had broken the illusion of normalcy. What once seemed like superstition now felt like truth. The overseer's sudden, inexplicable end was the moment the line between coincidence and curse vanished. From then on, no one doubted that Samuel carried something unholy with him. Whatever it was, grief, vengeance, or darkness itself, it was growing stronger, and the people of the Dumont plantation would soon learn that the first death had only been a warning. After the overseer's death, the Dumont plantation fell into a suffocating silence. The workers spoke only in whispers, avoiding the boy as if his very shadow could cling to them. But it didn't take long before tragedy began to follow Samuel wherever he went, no matter who tried to take control of him. Word of the strange deaths and misfortunes spread beyond the plantation gates, traveling down the muddy Louisiana roads to neighboring estates. Everyone had heard of the boy who destroyed, yet no one wanted to believe it until the pattern became undeniable. When Charles Dumont finally decided to sell the boy, it wasn't out of greed, but fear. His wife had fallen gravely ill without cause. The house dogs had turned on one another, and one of his horses had been found dead in the stable, its eyes open and mouth twisted as if it had died screaming. Dumont told himself it was coincidence, but when his wife awoke one night, claiming she had seen the boy standing at the foot of her bed, silently watching her sleep, he could bear it no longer. Within a week, Samuel was sold to a trader from Baton Rouge named William Cormier, a man who prided himself on being unafraid of superstition. Cormier thought he was getting a bargain. He laughed when Dumont offered the boy for half his worth and dismissed the whispers as plantation gossip. But the moment they left Louisiana's bayou roads behind, the trader began to understand that he had taken something far darker than a child. On the second night of their journey, one of his men was found dead by the campfire, his body rigid, eyes open wide, just like the overseer's had been. No one had heard a sound. The next day, the horses refused to move. They kicked and reared until one collapsed, foaming at the mouth. By the time they reached Baton Rouge, the trader's entire crew had turned against him. They refused to keep the boy another night, saying that he spoke to the dark, that they'd seen him whispering into the empty air while his chains rattled softly. Cormier, shaken but unwilling to appear weak, sold him the very next morning to another plantation, this one belonging to a wealthy widow named Margaret Lebeau. She was a woman of strong faith and sharp mind, known for her charity but also for her pride. She said she would take the boy in and purify him through prayer and discipline. For a time it seemed as though peace had returned. Samuel was quiet, obedient, almost invisible. The widow kept him close, believing that kindness could cleanse whatever shadow clung to him. But within weeks, her servants began to complain of nightmares. They said the boy stood outside their rooms at night, just staring through the doorways. Fires broke out without reason, the curtains in the parlor, the hay in the barn, and once even the Bible on the mistress's bedside table. Every time Samuel was nearby, watching. Then came the night the widow's nephew, a cruel young man who often taunted the boy, disappeared. His body was never found, but his horse returned to the gate at dawn, its saddle soaked in blood. After that, the Lebeau plantation was never the same. Workers fled in the night, and those who stayed refused to go near the boy. The widow herself began to lose her mind, claiming she heard her nephew's voice calling to her from the fields. One morning, she was found floating face down in the pond behind the house, her rosary clutched tight in her hand. When the authorities arrived, they found Samuel sitting nearby, covered in mud but unharmed. He said nothing, only stared at the water as if waiting for it to speak back. No one could prove anything, but no one dared keep him either. Once again, the boy was sold, this time for almost nothing, to a trader desperate enough to take him. But wherever he went, death followed. Owners fell ill, families vanished, homes burned. The stories began to spread across Louisiana of a boy whose touch brought ruin, whose gaze carried death. Some said he was born under a curse, others whispered he was something far older than human. Every new owner thought they could control him, cleanse him, or profit from him, and every one of them met the same fate. It was as if the boy carried a dark tide within him, silent, patient, and unstoppable, destroying every soul foolish enough to think they could possess him. By the time Samuel's name passed through the parishes of Louisiana, it was no longer spoken aloud. People simply called him the one you don't look at. And wherever he went next, they prayed the earth itself would swallow him whole before his curse reached them too. The boy's fourth chapter of terror began when he was sold yet again, this time to a small plantation deep in the swamps near St. Martin Parish, a place so remote that few even knew it existed. The man who bought him, Elias Granger, was a stern preacher who believed all evil could be beaten out of a person through the word of God and the weight of a whip. When the slave trader delivered Samuel to him, he told Granger plainly, "That boy's bad luck. Every house he enters turns to rot." Granger only laughed. He believed the curse stories were the devil's lies meant to test his faith. He promised he would save the boy's soul, even if it meant breaking his body to do it. From the first night on Granger's property, the air grew colder, heavier. The plantation was small, a few dozen slaves, a creaking chapel, and a house that leaned into the moss-covered trees. The preacher made Samuel sleep in the cellar below the chapel, saying it would keep him close to the Lord. He forced the boy to pray for hours every morning, kneeling until his knees bled. When Samuel didn't answer fast enough or failed to recite a verse correctly, Granger struck him and shouted scripture, convinced he was driving out demons. But what the preacher didn't understand was that the more he tried to force the boy into the light, the deeper the shadows seemed to grow. The slaves began to whisper that something unnatural had come among them. The animals grew restless. Dogs howled through the night, chickens refused to lay, and one morning all the cattle were found dead, their eyes wide open, their bodies untouched. Granger claimed it was disease, but the overseer swore he'd seen the boy standing among the carcasses before dawn, staring at them as if waiting for them to move again. The preacher refused to listen. He believed the boy's presence was a test of his faith, and that he alone was chosen to overcome it. Then the nightmares began. Every night, Granger dreamed of fire and of a face, Samuel's face, emerging from the smoke. In the dream, the boy whispered things he could not remember upon waking, yet he'd find those same words written in ash upon his floorboards by morning. His wife began to see things too. The boy's reflection in mirrors where he wasn't standing, muddy footprints leading up to her bed, whispers echoing through the halls when no one else was awake. She begged her husband to send him away, but he refused, saying to yield would be to let evil win. It all came to a head on a storm-heavy night in April. Thunder rolled through the swamp, lightning slicing the sky as Granger dragged Samuel into the chapel. He had decided to perform a cleansing ritual, a baptism of fire and faith. He filled the small room with candles, recited scripture in a trembling voice, and demanded the boy confess his sins. Samuel said nothing. He just watched the preacher with that same stillness that had unnerved so many before him. Then, without warning, every candle flickered out at once. Granger's wife, who had come running at the sound of her husband's shouts, later said the chapel went completely dark, so dark it was as if the storm itself had swallowed the building. When the lightning flashed again, she saw Samuel standing behind her husband, though moments before he had been chained to the front pew. She screamed, and the preacher turned, his face pale as bone. What happened next, no one could fully explain. The chapel caught fire from within, flames spreading across the floorboards faster than the storm could drown them. Granger's wife escaped, but when the others reached the chapel, it was too late. The preacher's body was found beside the altar, untouched by flame, but frozen in terror, his eyes wide and his mouth open as if still gasping for air. And Samuel, he was gone. No trace of him remained, no footprints, no body, nothing. The slaves swore they saw him walking into the swamp that night, barefoot and unburned, the lightning flashing around him like a crown. The next morning, the plantation was abandoned. No one dared stay after what had happened. The chapel was left in ruins, and those who later passed through the area said they sometimes heard a child's voice echoing from the swamp when the storms rolled. In that night marked the boy's transformation, from cursed child to something far darker, an omen, a ghost story whispered across Louisiana. To those who survived, Samuel wasn't human anymore. Whatever humanity had once lived in him had been burned away in that chapel fire, leaving behind only a presence, silent, wandering, and deadly. And though the preacher thought he could save him, it seemed the truth was the opposite. The boy had destroyed the one man arrogant enough to believe he could conquer evil by becoming the very thing he sought to defeat. After the fire at Elias Granger's plantation, the boy's name was spoken only in fearful whispers. No one knew where he had gone. Some said he drowned in the swamp that night. Others swore they saw him wandering barefoot through the cypress groves under the lightning, untouched by flame or rain. But wherever he went, misfortune followed like a shadow too thick to escape. By the summer of 1856, Samuel had become more than a rumor. He was a warning. People along the Louisiana rivers spoke of a wandering boy who appeared before disaster, whose silent presence meant death was near. That same summer, a steamboat called the Seraphine set out from New Orleans, bound for Natchez, carrying traders, families, and a small group of enslaved workers being transported upriver. Among them was a boy who no one had paid for, a stowaway found asleep in the cargo hold 2 days after departure. The captain, James Holbrook, ordered him brought to the deck for questioning. When they asked his name, he only said, "Samuel." His voice was calm, steady, almost too calm for a child alone on a riverboat. He didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't explain. The passengers assumed he was just another runaway, a lost soul trying to escape the plantations below. But the older slaves chained near the cargo deck grew restless when they heard his name. One muttered that the devil had found his way onto the boat. From the moment Samuel was discovered, strange things began to happen aboard the Seraphine. The river, usually calm in summer, grew violent. Thick fog rose from the water, wrapping the boat like a shroud. The paddle wheel jammed twice, and one of the engineers was crushed while trying to fix it. The passengers blamed bad luck, but the slaves whispered that the boy had brought something with him, something that wanted no one to leave that river alive. At night, the sound of chains rattling echoed through the hull, though the enslaved workers were asleep. The crew claimed to hear whispers rising from the water below, like hundreds of voices speaking all at once. Captain Holbrook, a man hardened by years on the river, finally ordered the boy confined to the upper deck until they reached Natchez. But that night, the fog thickened to the point where they couldn't see the bow from the wheelhouse. The pilot swore he saw a figure walking along the edge of the deck through the mist, small, barefoot, and glowing faintly in the moonlight. When he turned the light toward it, there was no one there. Minutes later, the boat struck something beneath the surface, a sharp, tearing impact that sent passengers screaming as the hull split open. The Seraphine began to sink. In the chaos that followed, people swore they saw the boy standing perfectly still at the bow, staring into the fog while others scrambled for their lives. One woman tried to grab him, shouting for him to move, but the moment she touched him, she fell backward as if struck by lightning. When rescuers later found her body, there wasn't a single mark, just a face twisted in terror. By dawn, the river was littered with debris and bodies. Only a handful survived. Among them was a deckhand who claimed he saw the boy floating downriver on a piece of driftwood, completely unharmed, his dark eyes fixed on the sinking wreck behind him. He didn't look scared, the man said years later. He looked like he'd seen it all before. After that disaster, no one questioned the legend anymore. River travelers began to tell stories of the cursed child who doomed every place he passed. Boatmen claimed that when fog gathered thick and low, they could sometimes hear a boy humming softly from the water. Some said it was a ghost. Others said the devil had taken the shape of a child to test men's souls. But among the enslaved, the story took on another meaning. They said Samuel wasn't evil. He was vengeance made flesh, born from centuries of pain, walking the earth to punish those who thrived on cruelty, and yet even those who believed that couldn't bear to see him. For wherever he appeared, suffering followed, innocent or guilty, it made no difference. His curse was like the river itself, deep, unstoppable, and always hungry. By the time his name disappeared from official records, Samuel had become more myth than man, a whisper in the dark waters of Louisiana. Parents warned their children not to stare too long into the fog, because sometimes, they said, the river stares back. And if you see the boy standing on the bank, silent and waiting, it means your time has already come. Years passed after the sinking of the Seraphine, but the legend of the slave boy who destroyed everything he touched refused to die. Samuel had become a ghost story that moved like a fever through Louisiana's plantations, towns, and river settlements. Every few years, another tragedy would strike somewhere along the bayou. A house burned, a family vanished, a field turned to ash, and someone would whisper, "The boy was seen again." By the late 1850s, even people who didn't believe in curses began locking their doors when fog rolled in from the river. But there was one man who didn't believe in fear, Colonel Abram Lafayette, a wealthy sugar planter and former Confederate officer known for his cruelty. Lafayette heard of the boy from one of his overseers, who claimed he'd seen a small, barefoot child wandering near the edge of the plantation. The colonel laughed it off at first, calling it Negro superstition, but when his dogs were found dead the next morning, their bodies twisted as if they'd fought something invisible, he began to pay attention. He ordered his men to find the boy and bring him to the manor alive. That evening they dragged Samuel out of the cane fields, silent and expressionless as always, his clothes soaked with mud and rain. The colonel studied him by lamplight and said, "So you're the one who brings death wherever he walks?" The boy didn't answer. He just stared. Lafayette wasn't a man of faith or mercy. He was a man of control. He decided to keep Samuel as a test of power, a way to prove that no curse could shake his authority. He locked the boy in a storage shed behind the main house, guarded by 2 armed men, and went to sleep confident that he had tamed the terror everyone else feared. But that night, the guards heard whispering coming from inside the shed. They described it as a voice both near and far, like wind moving through the trees, but speaking words they couldn't understand. One of them tried to open the door, but the handle was so cold it burned his hand. By morning, both guards were dead. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just open eyes and blue lips, as though the life had been drawn out of them. Lafayette's anger turned to rage. He accused the remaining slaves of poisoning the men and ordered brutal punishment for anyone who had spoken the boy's name. When his overseer suggested freeing Samuel or handing him over to the authorities, the colonel laughed again and said, "I'll show that demon who owns this land." He brought Samuel into the main hall, tied him to a chair, and demanded to know what he was. The boy said only one thing: "You can't own what's already dead." That night the house began to shake. Doors slammed by themselves. Oil lamps burst into flame, and the colonel's prized mirrors cracked from corner to corner without being touched. His wife claimed she saw figures moving in the walls, dark silhouettes that whispered her name. The plantation's workers fled into the cane fields, leaving the Lafayette family alone in that haunted house. At midnight, thunder rolled over the swamps, and the manor caught fire. Witnesses from miles away said they saw the flames rise like a pillar, bright enough to turn the night sky red. When the fire finally burned out, the estate was nothing but blackened ruins. The colonel's body was never found. Some said he died in the blaze. Others swore they saw him running toward the river, his clothes on fire, screaming the boy's name. As for Samuel, he was gone again. But among the ashes, investigators found something chilling, small, barefoot prints leading away from the ruins, straight into the swamp. In the months that followed, the surrounding parishes suffered one calamity after another. Storms destroyed crops. Disease took livestock, and several children vanished near the bayou. Every time, someone would claim they'd seen a small figure standing in the mist, silent, unmoving, watching. The priests who came to bless the land refused to stay after dark. They said the air itself felt cursed, as though the earth remembered what had happened and would not forgive. By now, Samuel was no longer seen as human. To some, he was a spirit of vengeance, sent to punish cruelty with ruin. To others, he was the devil's child, feeding on fear and death. But the truth was more terrifying. No one knew what he was, or why he never seemed to age, or why he never died. He was simply there, an eternal presence bound to Louisiana's blood-soaked soil, haunting the living like a memory that refused to fade. And so, in 1856, the boy who had once been beaten, sold, and abandoned had become something untouchable. Every soul that tried to possess him, harm him, or save him was destroyed. His curse had spread beyond one plantation, beyond one family. It had become part of the land itself. And to this day, the old folks of the bayou still say that when the fog rolls thick over the river and the air grows too still, you shouldn't look too hard into the mist. Because somewhere out there, barefoot and waiting, walks the boy who destroys everyone he touches. Years after the burning of the Lafayette plantation, the legend of the cursed slave boy had become woven into Louisiana's dark folklore. Half history, half nightmare. Some said Samuel was long dead, swallowed by the swamps that had hidden so many lost souls. But others swore that he was still out there, wandering the back roads and bayous, a spirit bound not by death but by rage. By 1860, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, stories of him had spread far beyond Louisiana, into Mississippi, Alabama, and even the Carolinas. Riverboat captains, traders, and slaves all carried the same warning. If you see a quiet boy alone in the fog, turn around. Don't speak, don't stare, and don't touch him. That year, a small community outside of Baton Rouge learned that some stories don't stay buried. The town was called Cypress Hollow, a settlement built around a lumber mill that fed off the swamp's cypress trees. It was a harsh place, ruled by a man named Silas Dunn, a devout Baptist and a cruel hypocrite who worked his men to death under the pretense of discipline and salvation. He believed in purification through suffering, and the slaves who labored under him often whispered that the devil himself would not set foot there because Dunn's cruelty left no room for competition. One foggy evening in September, a young woman working in the fields claimed she saw a boy standing at the edge of the swamp, barefoot, still and watching. She said his clothes were torn, his face pale, and his eyes darker than night. When she told the overseer, he struck her for spreading fear. But within a week, strange things began to happen. Tools went missing, animals grew restless, and one morning the mill's foreman was found hanging in his workshop with no sign of struggle. The wind that day carried the sound of creaking wood through the trees, almost like laughter. Dunn blamed rebellion and doubled the punishments. He forced the workers to kneel in the mud and pray for forgiveness, claiming that Satan had entered the camp. But each night the fog grew thicker, and each morning someone else turned up dead. No wounds, no signs of poison. Just faces frozen in horror, like they'd seen something too awful to name. One survivor, a young boy from the mill, later said he'd woken to find Samuel sitting beside his bed, staring at him with empty eyes. When he blinked, the boy was gone, but his blankets were soaked through as if he'd been dragged from a river. By the fifth night, Dunn's faith began to break. He gathered his remaining men and marched toward the swamp, carrying torches and chanting scripture. They found footprints leading into the cypress roots, small, bare, unmistakably human. As they followed, the fog swallowed them whole. What happened next became the final chapter of Cypress Hollow. A week later, a passing traveler found the settlement in ruins. The mill had burned to the ground, the workers gone, and the swamp waters had risen to swallow half the land. Dunn's body was discovered floating near the edge of the river, his Bible clutched tight against his chest, his eyes open wide, reflecting the sky like glass. Of Samuel there was no trace, but in the mud near the mill's wreckage, the traveler found tiny footprints leading away into the mist. Word spread quickly. Preachers claimed it was divine punishment. Others said the swamp had simply taken back what man had stolen. But for those who had heard the old stories, there was no doubt it was him. The boy who destroyed all he touched had returned, not as a slave, not as flesh and blood, but as something eternal. He wasn't bound by chains anymore. He was bound by vengeance, his presence marking the end of those who thrived on pain. In the years that followed, Cypress Hollow became one of Louisiana's lost places. No one rebuilt there. The trees grew over the ruins, and the swamp reclaimed the land. Locals said that when fog drifted low over the cypress roots, you could still see the glow of old lanterns moving between the trees and hear faint whispers calling your name. And if you were unlucky enough to follow those voices, you'd find a boy waiting for you at the water's edge, barefoot, silent, his eyes filled with the memory of every soul he had ever taken. By then, Samuel was no longer seen as human or spirit, but something worse, a wound in the world itself. His existence was a reminder that pain doesn't fade, it transforms. It becomes part of the land, part of the air, part of the stories people tell to warn their children. He was the echo of centuries of suffering, moving through time like a ghost that could never be laid to rest. And in the dead quiet of a Louisiana night, when the wind dies and the swamp stills, some say you can still hear him humming softly in the distance, a lonely sound that chills the blood and silences the heart. The cursed boy of 1856 never left. He just waits in the fog for the next soul foolish enough to reach out and touch him. Decades passed after the tragedy at Cypress Hollow, and yet the legend of the slave boy, Samuel, the one who destroyed everything he touched, refused to fade. Time turned his story into whispers, his name into a warning. By the late 19th century, most people dismissed it as old Southern folklore, a tale invented to frighten children or remind masters of their sins. But in the deepest corners of Louisiana's bayou, where the swamp never forgot what it had seen, people still swore the boy walked among them. He was not a ghost that came and went. He was a presence. The land had absorbed him. He was in the mist that crept over the water, in the creaking cypress roots, in the cold wind that rose before disaster. Around 1890, the legend returned with force when a wealthy lumber company from New Orleans decided to clear part of the old Cypress Hollow region. The men who arrived to cut the trees had no time for superstition. They laughed at the local guides who warned them about the cursed ground, and they mocked the stories of the barefoot boy in the fog. To them, ghosts were for the poor and the uneducated. But the swamp had a long memory, and Samuel's curse had never truly ended. It had only been waiting. The crew set up camp near the ruins of the old mill, where trees had grown through crumbled foundations, and the water shimmered with strange colors at night. Within days, their tools began to vanish. Axes rusted overnight, saw blades dulled for no reason, and their supplies spoiled faster than nature could explain. The men grew restless, convinced someone was sabotaging them. One night, a foreman named Mason caught sight of movement near the tree line, a figure small and thin, standing perfectly still among the fog. Thinking it was one of the locals trying to frighten them, he gave chase. The others followed the sound of his footsteps into the dark. They found his body the next morning, half submerged in the swamp, eyes open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. No marks, no struggle, just that same paralyzing look of terror described in every story before. The men were shaken, but the company's owner, Mr. Harlan, refused to halt operations. He ordered them to keep cutting, declaring, "The dead can't stop progress." But the swamp had its own rules. Each night after that, the fog came earlier, thicker, heavier. It seeped into their tents, carried whispers that no one could understand, but everyone could hear. Men began seeing the boy in their dreams, standing at the edge of the firelight, watching with hollow eyes. Some woke screaming, claiming they felt cold hands around their throats. One worker swore that the boy spoke to him, saying, "You shouldn't be here. This land remembers." The next day, that man walked into the water and never came back. Within a week, half the crew had vanished or fled. The few who remained were found days later on the outskirts of the swamp, wandering aimlessly, their minds shattered. They mumbled the same thing again and again. "He's still here." He never left. The company quietly shut down operations and sealed the site, officially calling it unsuitable for development. But those who lived nearby knew better. They said the boy had awakened again, his curse stirred by the sound of saws biting into the land that had buried his pain. Over time, the swamp consumed what was left, machines, tools, and even the bones of those who never made it out. Nature closed its hand over the place, as if to keep the secret buried. But the locals kept telling the story, passing it from one generation to the next. They said Samuel's soul could never rest because he was not born of evil, but of suffering. He was the echo of every cry that had gone unheard, every lash that had drawn blood, every life taken for greed. The boy wasn't seeking revenge anymore. He was simply repeating history, trapped in an endless cycle of pain that no prayer or priest could break. By the early 1900s, the story had taken on new forms. Hunters spoke of seeing strange lights floating through the bayou, like lanterns drifting in the fog. Travelers claimed they heard a child's voice humming old plantation songs near the water's edge. Some even said that if you called his name 3 times after midnight, he would appear behind you, silent, barefoot, and dripping wet. Those foolish enough to try were never seen again. To this day, the swamp where the Cypress Hollow once stood remains untouched. Locals call it the still water. No birds sing there, no boats cross its depths, and when the mist rises thick and white, people turn away. They say the land belongs to him now, the boy who died too many times to stay buried. The boy who carries the sorrow of 1,000 souls. The boy who destroyed everyone he touched. And sometimes, when the moon is full and the river glows silver, those who live along its banks claim to see him standing there still, unchanged, unaged, watching, waiting. For what? No one knows. But the old ones say that as long as the swamp remembers its pain, the boy will remain its guardian and its curse. Because some stories, born of blood and madness, never truly end. They just change shape and keep walking among us.